Hi, hello, welcome to my review of this new Martin Scorsese movie, Killers of the Flower Moon. If you don't know who Martin Scorsese is, this guy is a relatively well-known director. Since the 70s, he at least made one classic per decade. In the 70s, he came out with Taxi Driver and a lot more, by the way. In the 80s, Raging Bull. In the 90s, Goodfellas. In the 2000s, he made The Departed. In the 2010s, he made The Wolf of Wall Street. And now in the 2020s, he made The Killers of the Flower Moon. This is basically a big celebration, kind of like Oppenheimer this year. A very well-renowned director comes on and makes a 3 hour long, in this case 3.5 hour long, historical epic, and it's very well acclaimed as well. Just in the case of Killers of the Flower Moon, it's also like very rare probably for these times, because not to say anything against Martin Scorsese, but the guy is old and we don't know how many movies we are gonna get from him. To be honest, this movie is big and very dense, and I don't think after watching this movie once I have the full picture of everything that happened in it, and I have the feeling that when I watch it the second time that I will understand it on and maybe even like it a lot more than after my first watch. But I kind of just want to get my initial thoughts about them out when this movie is still fresh. So this movie is about the Osage. They are a tribe of Native Americans, and at some point they found oil, and with oil comes money, and with money comes greed, and with greed in this case comes violence and murders, because there is a streak of murders in this community of Native Americans that happened at some point in history. And I'm actually really not sure when exactly this took place. But yeah, this is basically a real story, or at least based on true events that actually happened. And this movie follows Leonardo DiCaprio, who is marrying into a family of the Osage tribe, and they are also rich, and so he kind of has to do a lot with this situation. I'm not going to get into details of what happens exactly in the film. So as I already said, this movie is 3.5 hours long. It's a very acclaimed director. It's also a very anticipated movie in general. It has a very important topic to talk about for a lot of people, and it's also in general just historical, and so there's a lot of things going on in just this long runtime. And so I do have to say that I did not enjoy everything about the movie, because I simply didn't get everything, or I didn't receive everything. Like, it's such a long movie, I couldn't always concentrate on everything, and when there's a like kind of boring scene, I really struggle to pay attention. This could definitely change on a rewatch, but I have to say that it makes sense for such a big movie that I wouldn't instantly enjoy everything about it. Just like, for example, Oppenheimer. For example, The Irishman, also a 3.5 hour long movie by Martin Scorsese, I thought was kind of fine, but not really that amazing on a first watch. But I rewatched it, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time. So yeah, some good things about the movie. First of all, generally the filmmaking. It's a very grand movie, and there are a lot of sets. There's a lot of costumes, and it all feels very real. I have to say, there are a few shots where I could see there's a big landscape, and they use some CGI to make it feel a little bit more grand, but it was not that noticeable. And to be honest, the scale of the story really fits the scale of how huge this movie is in general. Also, the cinematography is not very stylized. It feels like a very objective look on this story, because these events really happened, and it feels like the filmmakers, and specifically Martin Scorsese, wants to make people pay attention to what happened there. So it makes sense that they wouldn't really try to glamorize anything that happened there. There are some very beautiful shots, but mostly it looks very just realistic, like it could look like that in real life. One of my highlights in this movie was definitely Lily Gladstone. She plays the, I guess, second main character in this film. She plays the wife of Leonardo DiCaprio, and she is an Osage. And yeah, she is very important in this film, and I think she was easily the best performance in the whole movie, because at first she's very quiet, and she seems like kind of a mysterious character. To me, she just seemed very uninteresting, but over the course of the first act, when Leo got to know her, and when this storyline of them took place, I really got to care for her, because she was very charming, and you could see that she was only talking when she really knew what to say, and she is a very observative person. And so the chemistry between Leonardo DiCaprio and Lily Gladstone really worked, because he was this very loud, or not loud, but very extroverted person who always has to talk, and she's just kind of fine when there's quietness, and she always has this specific look at Leonardo's character, who's called Ernest. So yeah, that was a very nice chemistry. Probably my favorite part of the movie, actually, even or at least that's the part that I was mostly emotionally invested, is when they two got together, because it was actually like, it felt like a very sweet romance at first, because I also did not know what this movie was really about. I did not know what to expect really, and so I was very surprised that there were actually some nice moments. Now, what I definitely have to take into consideration making a rating about a movie, or generally like forming an opinion about a film, is the fact that my expectations are not always the reality. So with a few movies, I already, like, I watched them and expected a certain thing of them, even though nobody promised them. I just expected it, and therefore I got to like a movie not as much. For example, Taxi Driver, I didn't know what to expect exactly, but I just didn't expect the way this story moved in the last act of the film. So I just didn't like it because it felt very random, even though that's just the flow of the story. And I know it's good because I watched it a second time and really loved it. The same is the case with this movie. I genuinely try to stay away from any information about any movie, but with this one specifically because it is such a big movie, I kind of want to go in blind. And so watching this movie, I was just trying to figure out what this movie is really about and what the story and the focus of the film really is. I knew it was a movie about Native Americans and murders taking place in the community of Native Americans, and Leonardo DiCaprio being in the middle of it in some way. I kind of expected him to be on the side of the Native Americans, which we saw in the movie was not the case. Yeah, he is kind of a piece of shit, like a big piece of shit in the film, which I did not expect, and that's not a bad thing, but because it went so much against my expectations, I was just kind of not as on board with the film when it happened, which is a bad attitude to have when you watch a movie. But that's just the case, and that's why I want to watch this movie a second time, knowing that this is going to happen. In general, the story is not bad. I do have to mention that I didn't think his character was the most interesting. Again, I thought Lily Gladstone was easily playing the most interesting character in the whole movie, and Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio was just kind of fine sometimes. I didn't always care about them. And because we see this whole story of these murders taking place through the perspective of a person who I don't really care about all of the time, it's kind of difficult to always pay attention, especially when a movie is 3.5 hours long. And this might change when on a rewatch, or it doesn't change, and then I will stay at the rating that I have right now. But that's just kind of a factor for why I didn't always care about what was happening. Then there's also the last act of the movie, or I don't know what exactly the last act of the movie is, because I managed to not a single time watch what time it is. But about the last act of the movie, I really thought it was just boring. And I see the last act basically as about the time when Jesse Plemons entered this movie, and when they are about to solve the mysteries of the murder. This whole storyline, or not the storyline, but this whole part of the story was just so boring to me. It feels like sometimes the filmmaking was just kind of very basic, and it felt like there could be something much more interesting going on. For example, the first conversation we had between Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio was so basic. It was very long. There were a lot of sentences said in that conversation. And the only thing we had in this conversation were two shots, one on Robert De Niro and one on Leonardo DiCaprio, and a third shot that was sometimes used, but that wasn't really that important. So it was a very long conversation. There was only two shots, back and forth, and it felt like this was so much more present in the last act of the movie, because it was only conversations in the end. And I have to admit, for that time I fell asleep like 2 minutes or so. So is this movie too long? I would actually say yes. I don't think 3.5 hours long is too long for a movie, because there's a few movies that long that I've watched that are better, definitely. For example, The Irishman is the last Martin Scorsese movie this far, and for the first time I thought it was kind of boring. On a second watch I really enjoyed it, and I think it's exactly the length it needs to be. This time around it could be the same thing, but I could also think on a rewatch that this is just boring, and that it's really too long with 3.5 hours. I don't know, but we'll see. So despite there being a very huge amount of moments that I didn't really care for, I still thought this movie was good enough to have the potential to rewatch it. Like, I really want to rewatch it, because not just because I know this is a very well acclaimed movie, but in general, it just feels like there is something in this movie that I didn't really get on a first watch, which makes sense. Also, I want to mention that the ending was amazing. I really loved the ending of this film, and it's the type of ending that makes you forget that you didn't really have fun for the last half hour. I talked so much more than I expected, actually, about this film. I think this is a good story, definitely an important story. It's a very interesting movie that I want to rewatch, definitely. Still, I don't think everything clicked with me as much as it could have. Maybe I will make a second video about this, actually, if I change my opinion so drastically that I want to talk about it. But who knows? For now, again, I will give this movie a 6 out of 10. But yeah, we'll see how that changes, or if it changes. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys, I guess, in the next video.